Now, when you read something like queering nuclear weapons, first you have to make sure it's not satire. These days it rarely is, like intentional satire. And honestly, I usually dismiss articles like this because, frankly, everybody else does too. But when I read about queering nuclear weapons in mid-2024, it was because Sneha Nair, the author, had just been appointed as a special assistant to the National Nuclear Security Administration, literally the federal department responsible for the US nuclear arsenal. And that changes things. Anything to do with nuclear weapons is automatically high stakes. Okay, so we do have to look into this, I guess. First step. Now, queer is one of those rather elusive words, and you're bound to get a lot of slightly different answers as to what it means, depending on who you ask. It is foremost a description for any kind of sexuality and/or gender expression that is outside the societal norm. So roughly speaking, anything not heterosexual and cisgender. What the hell do nukes have to do with sex? Hopefully nothing, but queer also has a more figurative meaning, and you could broadly translate it to anti-mainstream or counterculture. Digging through several articles and studies about queering nuclear weapons, the main points I could identify were these. It is bad to exclude queer people from the nuclear weapons field. The perspective of queer people is unique and would add significantly to the field. Queer theory can be applied to nuclear weapons to show how bad they are. Now, this here is a channel about physics and science, so I will gladly leave the first 2 points to people more interested in politics or HR and only talk about point 3, nuclear weapons. Apart from all the usual buzzword salad you can expect, the main queer position is that nuclear weapons are bad and all the funds spent on them should rather go to social causes. Also, all the political and military ideas about nuclear weapons must be re-evaluated through a queer lens. And this includes asking who came up with the idea of deterrence and who benefits from it and whose perspective is excluded, which I think is perfectly fine. Whenever discussing nuclear war, though, I like to bring up these 3 unsavory facts. First, war can be an attractive option. Second, nuclear weapons are powerful and thus desirable. Third, we already are in a nuclear standoff and cannot simply walk out. These are not pretty, they're not nice. In fact, the main reason why I decided to do this video was to remind people of these. Especially people that are too young to remember the Cold War. This is unfortunately something we need to be reminded of. Especially in societies that haven't had to fight for their survival and haven't been under direct military threat for generations, like most first world countries are. Today, large portions of the population in the West simply think that we have evolved beyond conflict and that war is a thing of the past. However, as the saying goes, people can sleep peacefully in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf. Our peace and safety are not safeguarded by our superior morals or civilization, but by our superior military and defenses. We just have outsourced these things so much that we sometimes forget they still exist. Because aggression, when it cannot be countered, is still an extremely successful strategy, and always will be. And this isn't savage or evil. All of nature runs on this principle. This also isn't changed by the fact that our polite modern society is looking down on it. For many people, nuclear weapons are just a hangover from the Cold War era and do not fulfill any purpose anymore. So let's look at least a toy model of the game theory behind nuclear weapons. This might be a bit too crude to be useful, but let's still do it quickly. If only the attacker has nukes, he is unstoppable. If only the defender has nukes, he is unassailable. And if both have them, they can only exchange destruction, so they cannot engage. A bit closer to reality. Essentially, yes, an attacker willing to use nukes becomes unstoppable. However, the destruction and irradiation caused by this means that they are a poor weapon for conquest. So often in an offensive, they are more useful as a threat than actually employed. A defender with nukes becomes unassailable because they can at any point destroy the invading armies and/or the entire country, in an extreme case of scorched earth. This is the ultimate deterrent. Don't attack us or you will perish with us. Where both attacker and defender have them, you get a state of mutual deterrence where neither can really employ them. Because when they do, the consequence is mutual destruction. This means that the nuclear conflict between two nuclear powers is generally a losing strategy for everyone involved. Note that this is still just a first-order approximation and real situations are much more complex, at the latest when politics and diplomacy come in. All of this makes it glaringly obvious that in purely military terms, nuclear weapons are very desirable because of their immense power. The Ukraine war has just recently shown how the mere presence of them can dictate the rules of a conflict, both in preventing Russia from entering a NATO country, as well as preventing NATO from directly attacking Russia for the invasion. The third important truth is that the nuclear deterrence game has started in the 1950s, and there have been escalations and easing of tensions, but it never ended. The two main nuclear powers, the US and Russia, still sit on thousands of nuclear warheads pointed at each other. So we are still in a Mexican standoff, a nuclear Mexican standoff. Now, nobody has their finger on the trigger yet, and probably it's more accurate to today's situation that nobody has drawn their guns yet. But everybody is keeping an extremely close eye on everybody else, for any muscle twitch or any shift in stance. Any change to the current situation could immediately unbalance it. Even if you just wish to de-escalate, everybody else has to do that with you. This has worked reasonably well in the 80s and 90s, but this process has stalled, or even died down in the last decades. Giving up on nukes is a huge potential disadvantage because it makes you vulnerable against those who still have them or who have secretly acquired them. Now, nuclear weapons have been invented and cannot be uninvented. Having them is a huge strategical advantage, but there are very real risks attached to them that we have to take seriously as well. In fact, any mitigation of nuclear risk is a desirable outcome. But complete nuclear disarmament could only ever happen when every nation on Earth commits to that policy and could be held accountable, which in the future could conceivably happen at some point. But until such drastic change is possible, it may be wiser to focus on some more attainable goals. I am not against the disarmament argument. In fact, I think it's important that people keep pushing it. It is also important to be realistic though, and to acknowledge the realities of the situation. And this whole queer discussion about nuclear weapons does, to me, not take place in the real world as it is, but more in a wouldn't it be nice if it were like that world. You know, if your entire plan relies on we could just do that, or if everybody would just, then you have no plan. Nuclear disarmament is a noble goal. It just regularly suffers from being championed by, frankly, the most naive and frivolous people. And you can be forgiven for thinking this also applies here. Anyway, I want to leave you with a saying that I was reminded of recently living in Germany during the Ukraine war. We must never leave control of nuclear weapons to the aggressive and the bellicose. That is too dangerous. But it is just as dangerous to leave it to the weak and timid.